extremely welcome to this meeting, particularly our guests from far afield. And I've no doubt that we'll all great entertainment from Pat's talk tonight. So without further ado, I introduce you to Pat Scanlan. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, John, for the introduction there, and we'll get started. I suppose I'm going to try to make this about an hour. Hopefully, I'll try and compress what I have into an hour. I'm going to be using a website, so I'm going to share my screen here now, and just to inform you that Shane will probably mute you all until we have a Q&A at the end. So I'm going to be doing all the talking and in the meantime. So I'm going to share screen now, which is basically a website. Hopefully you're seeing it there now. It's called scanlanavia.com. And if you can see a picture of Ireland, just nod there. Yeah, okay, great. So welcome and thanks for the introduction. I suppose in a nutshell, I'm from County Limerick, from Castlemahon, the place of where these guys come from as well. So I share an interest being a Scanlan surname, but also the motivation for me was way back in 1974 or 5, whatever. I was at school in Castlemahon, and the teacher at the time, Dan Nash, sat us down and asked us to do an essay on a fellow called Michael Scanlan. And I remember doing an essay, I don't think I did a very good job of it, so I'm going to make up for it tonight. And I always thought, well, let's find out a bit more about the Scanlans, where they came from, and what they did after they emigrated. So that's the topic. The focus on the first part of the talk will be on where they are from, on the first 1800, the 1800 century, the 19th century, effectively. So we start basically in Castlemahon, where's this place at the bottom of, I'm going to just change my my laser, or what do you call it, mouse here, into something that's easy to spot. So basically, here we are. Oh, hang on, it's gone again. Technical issues. So, yeah. So basically, where the turning wheel here is in Castlemahon is in West County Limerick in Munster, and it's typically a kind of a agricultural area. Back in the time in the 1790s, 1800s, it was agricultural then. The main activity was agriculture, tillage, bit of cattle, a lot of milling went on there. And at the time of the turn of the century, there was major events happening in Ireland. There was the Battle of the attempted landing in Kinsale in 1796 by the French, the Wolf Tone Rebellion in 98, which had a French assistance in Wexford. It was crushed by the Crown, of course. The Act of Union in 1801 was passed, unifying Ireland and Britain in an economic so-called union. I suppose one would say later on that it was a disaster for the 19th century. There was a failed rising with Robert Emmet in 1803, where he was executed. So there was a lot of upheaval, ongoing upheaval with Irish occupation, and I suppose going into the 1800s, when the Scanlans were little babies walking around the place, it was strangely a prospering time. During the wars going on from 1803 to 1915, the Napoleonic Wars were actually a prospering time for Ireland. Agriculture, produce, meat was needed for the soldiers to feed them, horses and grain and so on, and clothing to feed and to provide the armies. So it was a very good time in agriculture, and a booming time actually in this part of the country. And the prosperity lasted until about 1813, and then things went sour. So not only did it go sour for Napoleon in Waterloo, but the Irish people suffered from a crash in prices and an agricultural depression that went on probably for the next 40 years. Prices never recovered. So sustained agricultural depression. Other things were going on. The population was increasing all the time, the subdivision of land. So the population in 1821 was 6.8 million in the total island. That's about the same as what it is now. There was riots, famine riots in 1817 in Limerick City. So all was not well, and those riots were as a direct result of post-war scenario where there was a sudden drop in demand for produce. And if we move on, we'll see here where Limerick is, again, in an old map of 1813. Mahuna is practically, it's only a few miles south of Newcastle West. And these roads didn't exist back then. In fact, the road building didn't happen until a bit later. The parish is known in GAA terms, Gaelic Athletic, as Fiona Castlemahon. Mahuna is the Irish name for it, meaning in Irish, the meaning of the plain of the tree stumps. So it goes by different names. Some people call it Fiona Castlemahon, some people call it Castlemahon Fiona, and other people call it Mahuna. There's a satellite map of the village. The parish system that the British put in place of parishes is very much the same as it is today. It overlaps with the Catholic parishes. And this parish is the parish I come from, or my parents come from, is the next one here in Killeedy. And actually, my own parish, I'm from the south of this parish, so it's quite a small area. The agricultural area, the catchment area, was in the 1800s run was a elitist owned by the absentee landlords, you could say. There was a 32,000 acre estate, Courtney estate, which covered a lot of this area, and a lot of the farming land was actually rented from that particular landlord, an absentee landlord most of the time. If we go in, zoom in a bit closer to the parish, the main topic of the discussion will be this village of Castlemahon. That's its signpost. The southern village, where half of it, in fact, these two parishes were separated by a river. I think Castlemahon to the north, Fiona to the south, were unified as a religious parish sometime in the 1830s. There was a major incident here. If you go to this village where I come from, I am actually from this spot, there was a major incident here in 1834. And if you go to this village, you will not find a commemoration to it, because as far as most people are concerned, it never happened. But it did happen, and it actually had a big impact on the collection of tithes subsequently. It was a kind of a watershed moment in the Daniel O'Connell tithe, abolished the tithe movement effectively. There was three locals killed, 20 injured in what was referred to by the British as a riot. It was actually cold-blooded murder in effect. And I think our friend here, Reverend Thomas Locke, you'll see him a lot. He was there with an armed escort to try and forcibly collect the rent. He went off with some rent, but he also, there was bloodshed, unfortunately. So there's a lot of, when you're on the website, you can then look at this information and read a bit more about it. A lot of my source had come from the parish annual, which had been going for 40 years, and local guys, voluntary historical research has generated 40 years of annuals, which are loaded with good information. And there's lots of credits to people I am referring to here who submitted information for what I'm presenting tonight. A lot of it's on the website. I won't have time to present it all, but there's a host of people here, locals, the Scanlan Foundation in Texas, various publications from Margaret Doody Scully, Gerard Curtin, Mannix Joyce, the Limerick City Council, and then descendants, some of who are on this call tonight, who also furnished a lot of useful information from their heirlooms or whatever. So to get started, basically, this local section here covers local viewpoints about the 1800s to 1820 period. There was near famine conditions between 1817 and 1820, crop failures, typhus, cholera. In Newcastle, the nearby major town, the Alexander Hoskins was appointed as the new agent by the absentee landlord. First thing he did when he arrived was he raised rents. He was extremely unpopular in this 36,000 acre estate. So everybody in the area was affected, and there was a massive increase in local evictions. A source of this is Leonard Howard. So the census there was 6.8 million.
Being recorded. I wonder, can I just ask you?
So noteworthy family observations is that two guys were born, Timothy and Mortimer Scanlan, who I'm guaranteeing 90% that they were brothers. They may have been cousins, but for the purposes of the research, we assumed they were brothers. Mortimer was a farmer and a merchant, and he supplied the Cork butter market. So he used to regularly go with horse and carriage and crate butter from Newcastle West to Cork. He often took passengers to Queenstown as well.
No, that's
The Scanlan ancestral home is still residing, and this is where the Mortimer was born and his family were raised. It's today split into two houses. I think Annette Coughlin, who's on the call, lives there right now. She operates a shop from there. His brother, Timothy, a miller, there was local milling exercise going on in a tuck mill, which is a type of cloth was made nearby. It's possible that he worked there. And he was born around 1798, as well as Michael. So they were brothers, I assume. In the early 1816, Mortimer married a local girl called Catherine Roach, very popular name in the locality. There are lots of Roaches in Castlemahon today. They had a couple of kids. The first child, I think, died. And then the other brother, married Ellen Hock, which is pronounced in the United States as Ho when they emigrated later on. So Hock Ho in around circa 1818. And the first child of their children was Edmund, born in 1819. And that's the marriage certificate there. So basically that's the first, an introduction to the first sort of 20 years of the century. We move on now to 1820, 1829. And I guess the headline here would be raising family amidst the local violence and hardship. Violence, this was an extremely violent period in local history in Limerick West. A lot of people don't realize it. A lot of people kind of bury it. I suppose the fact that it happened there's been excellent material written on the topic, which I came across about from guys called Pat Feely, Gerard Curtin, have written entire theses on the topic of the violence, sectarian violence, and anti-British feeling effectively in West Limerick at the time. The population in 1821 had risen to 8.5 million. That's quite an increase in a short space of time. So there was continued pressure on the local economy. There was bitter opposition to tides. There was a torrential rain and floods in 1821 with crop failure. Agrarian violence is what was referred to as between 1821 and 1824, the so-called Rockites. Rockites were a local gang of vigilantes, you could call them. They were extremely violent. They caused numerous killings, I suppose. Hoskins, remember earlier on, his son was beaten up and murdered in Barna and West Limerick. And that he basically their mode of operation was to terrorize landlords, terrorize Protestant church, terrorize anybody who basically was basically giving the landless, I suppose, laborers a rough time. So they were on the side of the landless courtiers and that space. So either way, the type of attacks that took place were pretty awful, actually. Murders, burning down houses, burning down churches. I think the church in Killeedy in the nearby parish was burnt down in the 1830s. So there was a lot of that going on. And, at the same time, there was armed assisted evictions and collections of rent. Daniel O'Connell was there in the middle of it all, trying to, to represent, I suppose, the peaceful view, and he had no time for the Rockites or the white boys. So there was that tension all the time. So there's a lot of useful links that you can click on the website about that. This one is about a book, actually, about a typical Captain Rock meeting. Captain Rock is a nickname for a fellow who was called Walter Fitzmaurice was his name, and he came from the neighbouring parish of Killeedy. They were all, this period was so violent, I suppose, that the British had to do something about it. So they basically organised the Irish Constabulary Act in 1822 and the Insurrection Act in 1822. Curfews were introduced to try and stop any activity. A lot of people were deported to Australia, even if they were just walking down the street at the wrong time. They they could have ended up on a boat to Australia. During that period of time, about 30 of these guys were executed, 60 more transported. The whole effort, I suppose, of the British, of the government forces to repel this was successful in the end. In 1824, the Rockite and White Boy agitation had petered out, stopped by about 1824. In 1822, there's an interesting comment here, and this is from the Telegraph in London, reported that County Limerick has a starving population of 90,000. That was in 1822. So things were not great, you could say. On the positive side, there was a road building program introduced by a man called Richard Griffith, who provided badly needed employment. So there was 250 miles road was linked between Cork, Kerry, and Limerick. A lot of that was actually to assist the constabulary as well and the army to gain access to places which were quite difficult, especially the hilly sides of West Limerick were well known to be harbouring the rebels who basically had no time for it. Between 1824 and 1830, many Roman Catholic churches were built in the West Limerick area. The Catholic Association by Daniel O'Connell campaigned for Catholic rights, and he was basically the champion of Catholic emancipation from a peaceful perspective. So you could say that if it hadn't been for Daniel O'Connell, things might have been a lot worse. Here's a section from the Newcastle paper in 1824, a list of the nobility and the gentry in the area. And the nobility included the Lord Courtney, Right Honourable Lord Courtney, who never set foot in the place. He was outside, he was in London most of the time. The Reverend Locke, Thomas Rock, rector for the Protestant Church in Newcastle West. He was no friend of this parish, to be honest with you. Looking back at it, you'll find references to him a few times. Lady Musgrave of Springfield Castle were the neighbouring landlords in the south of the parish. They were quite good, actually, quite honourable. Lord Edward Massey owned a lot of land near the village of Castlemahon itself. So that's basically kind of local history. If we go back to what the Scanlans were doing in the meantime, well, remember Mortimer and Catherine now had several children, Catherine, Mary, Pat, Catherine, Edward and Timothy, between 1817 and 1829. Apparently 2 girls died of cholera. I'm not so sure whether it happened or not, but that happened. It wasn't not unusual to have infant deaths in those days. On the blue side of the family, that's Timothy's family and Ellen. They had also 5 children: Mary, John, Mortimer, Pat, and Timothy. Timothy we'll get to again later on because he's an interesting character. And all the family here ended up in the US, and so did this family here as well. So noteworthy observations, I suppose, is that Tim, in 1826, the Timothy of Mahuna was availing of the Flourish Poverty Relief Fund. There are some scatterings of documents, but it's quite difficult to find much about Timothy, really, Timothy and Ellen. There's a little bit more about Mortimer's family. On the left-hand side, there's a litany of atrocities that took place in the locality, like the burning down of houses, and also the maiming of cattle was quite popular as well. And there was lots of greenfield meetings held in the middle of the night by the white boys, organizing or threatening people who were helping sort of landlords or whatever. So this kind of activity was going on all the time. And it was a violent decade for sure. So we move into the 1830s now. And this one, the tide wars were still continuing. One of the positive signs was that finally national school system had been introduced. All this time between the 1800 and 1830, education was not available to the Catholic population. Catholics weren't allowed positions of power, and basically it was a very apartheid system. And that was about to change, hopefully, with the introduction of free education. There was a spate of general elections, which Daniel O'Connell was quite successful in getting more representation from the Catholic voice. The poor law was enactment of the compromise poor law was introduced in 1838, and its coercion of thousands of people into 163 workhouses around the country. So there was a lot of poverty, and something had to be done to help the poor people survive. So the concept of a workhouse happened in the 1830s. Finally, in 1838, the Tithe Act was abolished. And part of that, I mentioned, was possibly triggered by one major event that happened in that parish, which was the killing of 3 in Fiohana in 1834. William Brown, James Griffin, and Darby O'Sullivan, who were, I think, maybe guilty of throwing stones, perhaps, but they were shot by the police, and the army, I think, did scooped up the rest of them. So the incident was actually raised in the House of Commons, so it was quite a serious event in the time. And Daniel O'Connell raised it in the Commons, actually, as an example of what was happening with the forced collection of tithes. There was some good fortune for, I think, the Scanlans in that age, because they were the ones to benefit from education in the new school established in Castlemahon. An excellent teacher called Daniel O'Callaghan taught that family from 1830 to the 1840s. I think he was there until the 1850s. He was a next door neighbor to the Scanlan family. Interestingly enough, when the school was being established, the Reverend Thomas Locke refused to support the school's development. He was another example of this guy who was not in favour of the local population at all. Food exports to the UK were going on as normal, even though there was starvation around the place. 1837, this was the distribution of army barracks in Ireland at the time, a heavily militarised country. I suppose we could say what was going on locally reflected all this. There was, there was actually in 1839, another massive event happened, which was a massive hurricane, probably the worst ever experienced, occurred in Ireland in 1839. It affected the western part of the country. So anybody who was living in a 4th-class house, hovel essentially, had most likely the roof blown off it in the wind. It was a violent storm that caused havoc in Ireland, and it took its toll, particularly in the southwest, where we're talking about here. So it would have definitely had catastrophic effects on people, also on crops as well. I guess there was a litany of crop failures during the 1830s. Just looking at a few here, the food riots in Limerick City in 1830, another cholera outbreak in 1832. Castlemahon was a hotbed of resistance to tithe collection. The shootings happened in 1834, and there was more events like that. So if you like, the Scanlans were living in the midst of you could say, tough times, where there was a lot of conflict, I suppose, in the parish itself every day. Michael Scanlan, the man who wrote that song and lots of poetry, was born in 1833. His younger brother, Mortimer, 35, and John Francis in 39, John F. These 3 guys actually hung out together. It's kind of unusual and not unusual as well, because they would have been the ones that would have benefited most from the education, I would have thought. Timothy and Ellen had 2 more kids, Jeremiah and Mary. And that was all the Scanlans born at that point there then. So basically now we have some issue about land. Where were they living? Well, Timothy and Mortimer each were mentioned in the landholders in 1833. 1833, Timothy had 1.4 acres. And we think that Mortimer, who lived next door to Daniel, also had a plot of land. He had 2.2 acres holding. So they were not very rich people. They got by. I think Mortimer also had 9 acres of first-class land. Whether he did or not, there might have been another Mortimer, but I think they got by, and that's how they lived. In 18, as I said, there was new churches being built in 1833, 1834, and this one's still standing. The church in Fiohana, St. Mary's Church, was built in 1833, and it still stands. It's a beautiful piece of work. Actually, the church bell for it was not intended for Fiohana. It was intended for the other church, Castlemahon. So the church bells got mixed up, but in any case, it still stands today. And that's a remnant from the past. If you're ever there, pay a visit for sure. If we move on to the 1840s, it gets worse. I mean, I could spend a year talking about the famine, but anyway, in the 1840s, we also had the first census. So the census saw that the population was now 8.1 million. And the famine years, well, what can we say? We had a potato blight struck in 1845, losing half the crop. Between 1843 and 1847, at the same time, however, and there was massive starvation and whatever. During this time, Britain felt it okay to spend 14 million to maintain control, law and order during that time. Far more that was spent on relief. Secondly, the number of military posted to Ireland almost doubled from 15,000 to 29,000. So conversely, we had a hunger and we had famine going on, but yet at the same time, the British were doubling the amount of military in place. The Pinito Blythe caused a population reduction of 20% by 1845. The British government introduced some Public Works Act to relieve the stress in 1846, but by then it was too late. There's been a fabulous documentary on this, if you can get your hands on it, made by RTE earlier in the year, or last year. It's called The Great Hunger, and it's well worth watching. Black 47 was the worst recorded. There was a rebellion again in 1848, but it petered out. It was quite poor in sense it strategically wasn't very successful at all. It took place in the town of Ballingarry, County Tipperary, but you can see that there was still a certain amount of opposition in the form of rebellions to the occupation, and hence that's why the militarization of Ireland continued. Here's a heat map here of evictions between 1845 and 1849. You can see that it's concentrated in Connacht, but also West Limerick got badly hit. Here's all the workhouses that were distributed around the country. So if you were starving or poor, the options were fairly stark. It was either disease, starvation, workhouses, or immigration. And those that had the money for immigration weren't in that class. So the chances are that most fourth class or people of dire poverty died of the first three. What was fourth class housing? Well, in the census of that census that took place there in 1841, there was a property census as well. What was first class, second class, whether you had attached house, whether you had a slate house, the number of rooms and so on. Fourth class house was essentially a hovel, or it could be in a hole in the ground, it could be in a cave, but it certainly wasn't what you regard as a house. It was usually an average cabin in Ireland was about 20 foot long, 12 foot wide, 7 foot high, one room, or one kitchen and a small bedroom if you're lucky. In Mahuna and Fiona, the parishes alone, multiple family cohabitation was common. There were 80 cases reported in the parish. So West Limerick was no bed of roses. In fact, the statistics just will show, and it has been researched, that after Galway and Mayo, parts of West Limerick were actually the third worst in terms of the impact of the famine in Ireland. There's a depiction of in Dublin on O'Connell Bridge of the walking skeletons, I suppose, of the time. So people were basically landless, no food, and starving, and many just died on the side of the road. There's an image there from the failed rising of 1848. So in terms of between 10 years, between 1841, here's a heat map of so-called fourth-class housing, hovels in Ireland, and the people that lived in them in 1841. By 1851, they had disappeared. Effectively, the people in them had disappeared, about 3 million. The entire lower tier of Irish society was in effect wiped out, including courtiers, landless, labourers and their families. And, you know, the largest majority of those probably didn't emigrate. So what was left behind, I guess, were the people who had the land, landlords and large farmers and landholders. It was a pretty rough time, the famine, to say the least. In relation to what happened locally, I suppose there was another 1843 repeal meeting in Castlemahon, at which the mere mention of the Reverend Thomas Locke once again brought forth a dreadful groan, and the blood-stained name of Fiona was still remembered 8 years later. So nothing had changed. There was still a high level of resentment in terms of the way things had panned out. Food rations were introduced in 1846. There was an outbreak of typhus, dysentery, and scurvy in 1846. The statistics for 1847 would show that the percentage of population on food rations in Newcastle West alone was the third worst in the country after Galway and Mayo. So between 1845 and 1847, Mahuna was very badly affected as well. There's a description there over there, which is probably too much to be reading now. But in 1847, the Destitute Poor Act was introduced, opening soup kitchens to feed the locals. The soup kitchen in Castlemahon was in operation in 1846, and Marty Scanlan himself was one of the wardens appointed for food distribution. The teacher, Daniel O'Callaghan, was a distributor at the food depot, and their neighbour, you'll see his name as sponsoring the kids as a godparent in earlier. He was a local supplier of coffins, making 353 of them in the month of March 1849 alone. So that would say that after 47 was a lot worse. The period after that, the death toll was actually higher. So the population in this parish of Mahuna, where these guys grew up, dropped by 40% effectively between 1841 and 1851. Castlemahon, the village itself, lost half its population. And where did they go? Well, where else could they go? They go to the United States, and the emigration boats began. Mortimer and Catherine's family, there was some marriages. Interesting marriage. The eldest girl Mary married a David Quaid. Quaid is a very popular name in Castlemahon. It's a very well-known name for sport and hurling, and there's a good chance that David Quaid is related to the Quaids who play Limerick, play hurling for Limerick today. Timothy married McMahon, and he went to work he emigrated to Boston, as did the other five actually. There was some grandchildren brought to the Quaids in Castlemahon. They didn't actually emigrate until 1851. The major emigration, I suppose, for the family in question here was in 1848. Beforehand, however, Mortimer, the father, had died in the winter of 1848, supposedly of contracting cholera. So I guess it was a rather rushed emigration, it seems. Catherine, the widow, departs Limerick in a ship called the Bark John Murray with 5 kids. That's her there at age 50. Catherine, Edmund, Timothy, Michael, Marty, and John took sail from Limerick City in that ship, and it arrived in Boston Harbor on the 26th of January 1849. So it was a rushed. I can think that what could be the worst time to go on a sailing across the Atlantic in the wintertime. When they arrived, they settled in a suburb of Roxbury in South Boston. The other family, Timothy and Helen, equally had issues, I suppose, with immigration. Timothy, the father, left sometime. I could never find the shipping record, but he left and brought with him Timothy, Mortimer, and Catherine. At least that's what I think. That certainly Timothy and Mortimer came with him. Catherine, Mortimer was a blacksmith. Catherine was a tailor, and Timothy, he ended up getting into business, but they moved to New York for a while. There were some marriages. The eldest of the Blue family, John, married a local girl called McAuliffe, and the immigrants show that they left in 1848, embarked from Limerick on a different boat called the Hannah in 1848. And their firstborn, Timothy J., was born in 1849. The Hannah, incidentally, is an interesting ship because a year later, it hit an iceberg with a bunch of immigrants, 120 immigrants from County Down the following year. Miraculously, most of them survived. They hung on to the iceberg, suffering from frostbite and everything else, but somehow they managed to be rescued and made it to Canada. So that's the famine years, which was a pretty dreadful time and caused immigration, widespread immigration. And that's where we got out to the 1850s. So Scanlans migrate to America. I guess there's American news on the left-hand side. I won't deal with that. But basically, the immigration story between 1846 and 55 was essentially 1.5 million Irish went to the US, 340,000 to Canada, 300,000 to Britain, and the other 50,000 to Australia and New Zealand. Many of those might have been forced, deported. If we look at the two migration paths, a bit like birds, really, the Blue family made it in 2 batches. Timothy left with the sons and one of the daughters in 1840s-ish. In 1851, Ellen, his wife, brought the rest of the family in 1851 to New York. They settled and combined in New York for a while. 18 1853, Jeremiah and Timothy, the two eldest sons, headed down south to Galveston and Houston for a while. Jeremiah then went back up towards Chicago around 1856. Timothy stayed in Texas, and that's when we'll get to talk about him again later on. This is a map of the US as it was in the 1850s, actually. The green bit is the occupied part. The white bit is the Native American Indians, the Comanches, Cheyenne, and the West Coast would have been populated in Canada, and you had Mexico. So, and the red bits is what was referred to then as English Canada or British Canada. So it was still developing as a nation. And the other Mortimer family, or Catherine Scanlan's family, Catherine Roach Scanlan, brought her family with them in 1849. They moved in to Chicago, lock, stock and barrel, between 1851 and 1853. The Quades, as I mentioned, joined them in 1851. So the entire Mortimer clan moved and settled in Chicago by 1853, which was some achievement, really, having spent about 2 years in Boston. The relevant goings on at the time in America, well, there was the great expansion of the rail and road. The cotton industry was enslavement was happening. Chicago was quickly growing city. There's a very high concentration of Castlemahon immigrants targeted Chicago, and are still there today, actually. There was other popular names that went on that ship, like Corbett, Clifford, McMahon. I think there was a few others mentioned tonight, Carmody. So in the south, Timothy, the guy who went south, found himself quickly developing in the city of Houston with a city of opportunity. And Houston and Texas was not part of the Union. It was not until about 1860s, after the Civil War. It was one of the last ones to rejoin the Union. So in terms of what events were happening with the Scanlans, well, there was the migration, obviously, in 1851 of the entire Scanlan family to Boston, from Boston to Chicago. There was more immigration. The Quades joined them. The Quades, once they joined, actually, they went across and became as the McQuades. So they're not known as Quades anymore. McQuade might have been the name that they were given when they arrived in Ellis Island, and it stuck. McQuade being the Gaelic version of Quade, so it's much of a muchness. There was some marriages. Edward married in 1853 in Boston. Catherine married Jeremiah O'Sullivan in 1856. 1859, the main man, I suppose, of the night, and Fenian man, was Michael Scanlan. He eloped and married Nellie Hogan of Limerick. I don't know where Nellie Hogan's from, but she was certainly from County Limerick. The McQuades then was saying Timothy, they had some more children in once arriving in Boston. Edward, and there's some more children born here. In 1858, mother Catherine Scanlan passed away. I've only found one reference to that, and it's recorded in a book about the American Irish written later on. So how accurate it is, I'm not sure, but I haven't been able to find a record of her death. There was soon to be some kids. All these families were quite good at baseball. So one would wonder, in terms of the Quades example, there was 2 baseball players, excellent ones were born. So one would say, did they pick up that from being very good at hurling? It's possible. The eye to ball coordination and all that. Timothy and Hannah had their firstborn in 1859, and Jeremiah and Catherine had 3 sons, Daniel, John, and Edward. I haven't been able to find anything more about them. But the Blue family then, Timothy and Helen, the family reunited in New York, like I said. They emigrated in 1851. They migrated. John and Margaret moved to Chicago, and the family was growing there. Jeremiah married Anne Sheridan, and our first born was in 1858. Here's the dispatch, I suppose. What did Edward do? Edward's the older brother of Michael, and he joined the business, a candy business, in 1854. And a few years later, he was able to buy out the firm and expand it. And that activity would become an important trade for the Scanlans for the next couple of decades. Timothy got established in the rail and road. Catherine married an O'Sullivan man. Michael's first jobs was as a shoemaker. He opened a sawmill. He was a shop assistant at a grocery. And the other brothers, the 3 of them, I guess Michael, Mortimer, and John, joined the Fenian Brotherhood in Chicago in 1858. Here's the ship, Mother Ellen Scanlan, bringing a couple of kids with her in 1851. As I mentioned earlier, Jeremiah and Tim, those two brothers headed south to Texas, and they started selling street knives on the street in Galveston, selling odds and ends. So they were street traders, made a few bob. Timothy moved on to Houston, and he became a merchant. And after a few years, Jeremiah went back up to Chicago to join the Castlemahon folk, and he started a plumbing business there. Catherine was a tailor, and Mortimer was a blacksmith, and they stayed in Chicago and didn't marry. Mary remained with the Ellen in New York. We haven't much more information about Ellen at all, really. And Timothy Sr. definitely presumed died before 1859. There are some pictures of the Timothy family, actually, Margaret and Mortimer, sister and brother. She was misfortunate to have lost two husbands, policemen, to gun violence, actually, and within a few years of marrying them. So she had to. And this is her brother, Mortimer J. Scanlan, who was an excellent National Baseball League player in his day. So we'll break with how are we doing in time-wise? Oh, we're not doing too well at all in time, actually. So I better break to visit Tim Scanlan here. Tim Scanlan of the Blue family became a millionaire, basically. He sold pocket knives from a tray and died a millionaire. A quote from the Galveston Daily News. This is him, aged in his 70s. During the Civil War, he's reportedly having smuggled cotton via Mexico, so he made a fortune. He was referred to as one of the scallywags, the Union guys who operated out of Mexico. He used a business alias as THS. His wealth, he had amassed a great wealth in Galveston and Houston. And after the Civil War, he declared himself as a Republican, and the Republicans took control of Houston City. He was appointed the 3rd Ward of Houston in 1868. He was appointed mayor of Houston between 1870 and 1874. He was referred to as the Reconstruction mayor, so he promoted the cause of freedom also for the blacks in the police force, supporting the election of black councilmen, which was way before its time. In 1875, the president named him as postmaster of Union, and that's the piece of paper down there that shows that. His interest was in municipal improvements, so he continued to invest money in the Houston Street Railway, the Texas Railroads, Houston Gas Light, and Houston Waterworks, which he became president of the Waterworks in the end. And he basically, this building here was built after his death by his daughters, and it still stands in Main Street in Houston today, the Scanlan building. He had property in Chicago as well, and he used to visit Chicago each summer as a summer house. And here's a reference from the directory in Chicago in the 1900s. T.H. Scanlan, capitalist, number 4885 Indiana Avenue. His family, he married Sophia, daughter of a German family, a wealthy Houston family in 1861 called Sophia Ebert, and they had 7 daughters who went on to live. I think they had about 10 daughters, but 3 died. These are 4 of the daughters here: Kate, Stella, Charlotte, and Lillian. Kate was the businesswoman who took over from Timothy, who died in 1906. Sophia died in 1898. So when Timothy died on holiday in Chicago, they used to go to Chicago to get away from the heat and the yellow fever. The daughters took over subsequently in the estate. They managed the estate until the 1850s. The last daughter, Stella, passed away in 1950, and her will, she willed the entire estate, as was the will of the family. They willed it to the St. Thomas University and to a Catholic trust to support the Roman Catholic education of priests for the dioceses of Texas, 12 dioceses of Texas. And they had a massive plantation on the south of Houston, which the girls decided to move out from the city and established a school there. So they were quite a philanthropic group of people. And today that philanthropic organization is still in operation. Its legacy is called the Scanlan Foundation. And it basically is a trust fund that assists with the education of the needy, I guess, and also promotes Roman Catholic diocese, priesthood missionaries, and so on. There are at the bottom of that page, there are some obituaries to that man. So this is the guy who came from nothing in Castlemahon and became a business leader, a politician, the mayor of Houston, and he also had a respect for, I guess, human rights as well. So I'll go back to the timeline, and we'll continue on to the next one, which is a 30-year. So I'm going to skip the 10-year decades. We'll be here all night. This one actually is a 10 years, 1860 to 1869. We had the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln. And on the right-hand side, we had these three guys. Michael, the guy in the middle, Mortimer, the guy on the right, his younger brother, and then the youngest brother is John. They were like peas in a pod, in a sense, because they took part in the Civil War. John F. Became a captain of that battalion of the Company B, and with his brother Michael. And Mortimer did some time in the infantry in those two infantries. They were in the hotbed of Fenian activity. In 1863, Michael became a senior official in the Fenian Brotherhood. And Michael approached Abraham Lincoln for support of Irish independence. He was also involved in giving orders there was a split off in the Fenian movement in the States called the Senate, and Michael was among those who were actually involved in an audacious attempt to annex pieces of Canada in trade for Irish freedom, I suppose. So they took part in organizing of attacks on the Canadian side, led by Colonel John O'Neill. These were all hardened soldiers from the Civil War, so they were actually quite successful in a couple of cases. They had a couple of victories. On the financial side of things and the business side, the candy company came in handy. I'm not going to deal with it now, but basically the Scanlans managed to run a very successful candy company in Chicago in the 1860s. Michael, Mortimer, and John all worked with that, along with the older brother, Edward, who was the brainchild behind establishing it. Mortimer was their key salesman, and he used the train lines into the Midwest to extend the reach of the candy business. In terms of poetry and literature, well, Michael Scanlan is renowned for that, and he published, his only publication was in 1866, a book called Love and Land, and you can click on that and read it if you want on the website. In relation to what was going on in Chicago, the population in 1860 was only 122,000. At the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was shot dead in 1865, and as I said earlier on, Grant became president, and he appointed Tim Scanlan to a major position in Houston. The families were growing. Obviously, in terms of Michael's family, we had with Edward. Edward had two daughters. McQuaid's had a very large family. Timothy had that son Mortimer and Margaret, and Michael and Nellie, Michael the Fenian. They had 4 children: Catherine Erin Kickham, which is an unusual name, named after the revolutionary Charles Kickham, I guess. Planksty, and also a very Celtic name. And Jeremiah Catherine had another daughter, and John F. Scanlan, who was also a very strong Fenian, I guess. He named his first child John Tone Scanlan, we believe. Joseph, Molly, and so that will tell you how I guess nationalistic fervor these people had. The Timothy family was married in 1861, and then they had a large family, as I said, the seven daughters. The last record we have of Ellen was from the Emigrant Savings Bank in 1860, showing that she and Mary and her daughter Mary were still residing there. Mary, we know, moved to Chicago subsequently. So at this point, I can just go and look at the younger brothers, Mortimer and John. who, this is Mortimer, and he was the quiet guy out of the three. He took part in the Civil War. He was also heavily involved in the Fenian movement and the so-called Fenian raids into Canada. He's this is a newspaper clip from his from obituary, and his other brother John. These animations actually are done with MyHeritage. So there's a we talked about this at the previous meeting. You can get a still photograph and animate it and bring them back to life, but put it that way. This guy, John Scanlan, married sister of a congressman. He worked alongside the brothers in the confectionery business. He was very much into trade and tariffs. He wrote this book about the Act of Union, and he criticized the British economic policy and how it destroyed Irish economy in the 1800s. The book still sells on Amazon, actually, and he wrote another book called Light on Tariff. In 1872, he was elected to the legislature in Illinois, and he founded an insurance company, the Catholic Order of Foresters, which still exists today, actually, and thrives in Illinois, in the town of Napierville. He wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln in 1862 to raise money for a fair. That fair was quite successful. It raised something like $52,000 back then, which was a lot of money. And I guess the next man we will look at would be Michael Scanlan, who is celebrated quite a lot in Ireland and in Limerick already. Michael, that's his animation there. In 2017, a monument was erected to him on the top of Knockfearna Hill in 2017 by the local history group and the politicians there. In 1969, a plaque was erected in front of the school, and this is the monument on the hill that you can visit. Quite a good walk and a fantastic view on top as well. There's the family homestead, which operates today as a shop and a post office by the Coughlins. It's split in two. I think the Columns, they live next door. As I said, you can visit the website and click on several songs here. The Jacket's Green, you heard earlier on. He also penned The Bold Fenian Men, Limerick You're Beautiful, which is, I think, a much better version than Limerick You're a Lady, in my view. And you have a Wolfe Tones version, if you're really into it later on, of The Jacket's Green as well. The book here you can actually click on and read if you want. It's called Love and Land, and it was published in 1866, and it's hosted on a site in the States. During the Fenian movement, they printed quite a lot of bonds. These are the $20 bond, which was printed to raise money, and the $10 bond had Wolfe Tone and Thomas Davis on it. This bond has Montgomery and Sullivan. And it's sold at an auction last year for $700. So that's good appreciation in time. Here's a letter written by Michael Scanlan to Abraham Lincoln, asking for a copy of his autograph for the fair. And here's a depiction of the famous Battle of Ridgeway, where the Fenians actually beat the Queen's Old Guard and routed them actually on the American-Canadian border. However, after some small successes, the U.S. government stopped supporting the Fenian Brotherhood, and then I guess Michael needed to turn to the pen, and he was editor of the Irish Republic as a newspaper for between 1867 and 72. He wrote his under the pen name Dionysus Blake, and the full collection is there if you want to click on it and read it. Later in life, he got appointed to the State Department, where he worked on tariffs, trade, and here's an excerpt from his study on American pork. Full report's there if you want to read it. He was given a commendation by William McKinley, president, on his work at the State Department. That's a source from Tom Heron of the Limerick Leader. There's a fabulous 9-pager written here by a historian called Mannix Joyce, who covers his life and history, his own family, his daughter Kitty Young Scanlan. The Youngs, he ended up being buried in her plot in Chicago in Calvary Cemetery is where all the Scanlans are buried. This is a granddaughter of Michael called Bessie Fleming. She lived until 1984. Erin was a daughter. Kickham Scanlan, I won't have time to go into it now, but this guy became a renowned lawyer and a judge, and there's a link on that. He lived until 1955. There's some of his granddaughters, who one of them died tragically in a car accident. Una Sampson Scanlan was married to a French national. That's her daughter, a granddaughter called Erin Scanlan Sampson. This is them, Erin and her dad on a voyage somewhere. Picture. Another daughter was Planksty. It's the only picture I could find of her, and she does some artwork as well with her signature on it, which is an heirloom in a house in the Fleming's house in Chicago. And this is the 2017 commemoration, quite recent, up on top of the hill in Knockfearna. There's our neighbour, Nora Reardon, actually, in the picture, and some local people. So that is Michael Scanlan in a nutshell. There's lots more information on the internet about him. We're doing okay on time. We're about an hour. We'll just take another 15 minutes and should finish it then, hopefully. The next 30 years was, well, there's a lot of American history here to the left. On the right, we had the disastrous fire in Chicago. Legend says it that Kate O'Leary's cow started the fire, kicking a lantern, but it actually caused 73 miles of fire, 17,500 buildings. So amongst those was Jeremiah Scanlan's business. His plumbing business was destroyed. But luckily, he had his wealthy brother down south in Tim who came to his financial assistance. But Jeremiah suffered smoke inhalation, and I think it shortened his life for sure. So Chicago was destroyed, but there was a rebuilding program. There was another fire in 1874. Another 800 buildings were destroyed in that, 60 acres of land. So fire regulations were improved, and new building of houses were, not as prone to fire. There was a financial crisis in 1873 in Chicago, and I think it impacted badly the Scanlan business as well. Down south, Tim was coining it, and that was developing by leaps and bounds. Between the 1880s and 1990s, Tim Scanlan became president of the Houston Water Company, and each summer, as we said before, the Scanlan daughters and the father would visit Chicago. There is a reference to him, the daughters going out fishing with Kickham, actually, the judge, at one point. So there's no doubt that Timothy, the blue and the green Scanlans, intermingled quite a lot each summer. A lot of the Irish in Chicago were heavily into, I guess, nationalism, but also into the Catholic Church and the Catholic Order of Foresters. The who's who of Irish in Chicago were members of that. So it was quite a successful operation, and also a very successful sort of social network, put it that way. Getting on to other things that happened in 1889, there was a famous trial of the murder of a Clon na Gael member, a Fenian called Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin, and his murder was big news in the States at the time, but the prosecution lawyer for that was none other than Kickham Scanlan, and that's him there carrying a weight down with books. Some of the witnesses were Scanlans as well. There's John F. at the stand, Frank's T. Scanlan. I think they were on the defense side. So basically, we had the Great Fire to Chicago. We had rebuilding of Chicago. We had all these things happening, but the Scanlan's families, there was a lot of second generation, next generation kids being born now as well. There was another immigration. The Quaids finally came over. David and Mary Quaid joined them in 1880. That's a bit tenuous, but I think that's the records show. And then there was some deaths, obviously. Michael's wife died quite young in 1871. And some of the other families were dying of the original Scanlan family. As Jeremiah the plumber has his obituary there. And then in the Blue family, we had we had some more children in Houston, and we had I guess Sophie, as I said, died in 1898. The Irish Republic newspaper ceased production in 1872 in Houston. There was a massive portfolio of business portfolio now by Tim, and Tim also he established a new city hall, a market house in under his watch in Houston, theater, retail shops, offices, and so on. This this book written in 1897 is online as well. It's worth a peek because it has it's about 800 pages long, but it refers to about 77 references to Scanlans in it, and other families too. I found a fellow from Drumcolor in it, County Limerick, and he and his brother became a priest, or became a Monsignor over there. This is the only picture of a Quaid that I could find, and this was Mary Scanlan Quaid's daughter. Her name was Mary Ann McQuaid, and it's a funny resemblance to the Quaids we know down in Limerick. Here's a picture of Frank T. Scanlan. He was also a damn good baseball player too. So we're heading into the period of the 1900s, and this is kind of the wrap up really in terms of from where today. It's like what happened in the 1900s. Well, there was a flipping point between the horse and the carriage, the car, World War One, economic depression, World War Two, Korean War, Vietnam War, and so on. Here we are to today. The Scanlans were, Timothy died in 1903, Michael, the Fenian, died in 1917. But if you were to scour the Irish press at the time, you wouldn't find a mention of it, neither of his Mortimer, because things were so tense in Ireland at the time that the government censor was actually, censoring this stuff. So it would have been inflammatory, I suppose, to have heard that a Fenian of this magnitude would have died in the US. So they were probably afraid of having a very large funeral in Dublin or in Limerick or anywhere else for that matter. On the Scanlan Hawk side, Tim Scanlan, the multimillionaire, richest man in Houston, died in 1906 while on vacation, as a memorial to his grave there. So Michael Scanlan, after his retirement, he continued writing and doing poetic work up to his death. Mortimer, the quiet man, I guess, was a deputy sheriff for several years in Chicago up to his death. Kickham Scanlan was a circuit court judge, the son of Michael's. There was some tragedies befell his family in terms of car accidents. In 1910, that building, the Scanlan building, was completed in Houston, and the original elevator, Otis elevator, still operates today. The Scanlan daughters moved out to their plantation and established a school. They were philanthropists, I suppose. Stella left the will to an estate and a trust, and that will in 1950 was contested in a very famous court case, which was well publicized in the US. The will was upheld, and the dispute, obviously failed. There was some war veterans. If you go through the scan, you'll find a number of war veterans, including this man called Jack F. Scanlan, killed in action in World War II in France in 1944. He was a great grandson of Jeremiah the plumber. And I suppose there was a local dimension as well that was mentioned by Keith Coughlin, who wrote in the Castlemahon Annual a few years ago that there were more Castlemahon folks now living in Chicago than in the original parish. There's a segment going on the left there. There's a link if you want to click on it to a MyHeritage family tree of these two families. It's always nearing completion. And there's a segment of it here that shows, for example, the Timothy Helen line. Jeremiah the plumber, his wife Sheridan, she was Irish. Son Edward married Nellie Jennings, Francis Percy, and so on. So you can wander around in there. Some pictures here of Bess Fleming, the lady I mentioned earlier on, with her daughters in the 70s. She's from the Catherine Young side of the family. Here's another woman, Margaret Daly Scanlan, who was a daughter of Mortimer J. In summary, I suppose, the timing of Michael, John, and Michael's deaths coincided between 1916 and 1922, and that's probably why they were never really celebrated at the time, because nobody knew about it. And Michael Scanlan was still not very well known, I suppose, until 1950. an event happened in Fiohanna Hall, actually. Mannix Joyce recounted the achievements of Scanlan's at a famous event that happened there. 1969, there was a plaque erected at the school, which you can see earlier on in the pictures. In 1981, the Castlemahon Fiohanna History Group was formed and has been busy ever since documenting various aspects of local history. Fantastic stuff. In 2017, this monument was erected in the picture we saw earlier on. The jackets green has been, you can have another rendition of it there, the Wolf Tones version. If you click on that, was Put the Song and one of his poems. The building in Chicago is the only monument that I know of to Tim Scanlan. It's a big monument, a 13-story building, and that's a picture of it, Google Maps. The Castlemahon group continued to create annuals every year. I think COVID was a bad. They didn't have an opportunity to create anything last year because of the COVID crisis, but hopefully we'll continue to generate more entertainment and local history information going forward. As I said, this picture here is from 1994, a black and white edition. I guess to be continued. So 10 minutes over the hour. I said you could continue. Feel free to visit the website, click around. There's a section there on baseball if you're interested. There was 4 very good baseballers among the crew, and that's it for now. I've completed, I think, a quick run through the Scanlans of Castlemahon and their explorations into the US.